Aha, our meeting is being recorded. So that's good. If anybody, let me know in the chat. So use the chat for questions. I'll just give you a quick introduction to Community Energy South, and then we can kick off. So as I said, my name is Ollie Pendred. I'm the Chief Exec of Community Energy South. We've been going since 2013, supporting the community energy sector in the southeast of England. We work very closely with Community Energy England, and currently we're in Community Energy Fortnight, which is an annual event for 2 weeks where community energy, so you'll see a lot of events about community energy over the next 2 weeks, and particularly in the year of COP26. It's very focused on net zero and local area energy plans and supporting communities. We see ourselves as the voice for the sector across the region. We look to capacity build for community energy groups and local energy, and we look at innovative and new business models for the energy sector for communities to be involved with. This is the map of community energy in the southeast at the moment. We actually run a mentoring program for community energy groups. So if you're in East Anglia, Hampshire, across Southhouse National Park, or in Surrey, or indeed in Sussex and Suffolk, do get in touch if you're interested in setting up as a community energy group, because we have a mentoring program and our mentors are on this session. So particularly, we're doing a lot with Essex County Council at the moment and Hampshire. So we've got lots of groups we're supporting there and getting them set up and running. So there's lots of expertise in the southeast, and we have the most amount of community energy groups in the southeast as of the whole of the country, which is very exciting. So we develop partnerships for across the region for the community energy sector. We do a lot of lobbying in government with Community Energy England, and these are some of our partners across the region. There's the Greater South East Energy Hub, which is set up by Department for Business and Energy to support energy as well, and we work with Network Rail, the Community Rail Partnership, UK Power Networks and SSE, and the water companies. So yeah, we try and link community energy goals with those big infrastructure organisations as well to support the communities. We're part of the Eastern New Energy Project, which is the last of European projects across the east of England. Have a look at this. I'll share this slide at the end. There's a whole consortium of support organisations that are supporting energy in the eastern region, and soon to be the southeast as well. So that goes on until 2023. It's the last of the European projects. And yeah, do get involved with Community Energy South. You can join our newsletter, join these masterclasses in future, enter the debate, and become a partner organisation or register your community energy group. Thank you. So without further ado, I will pass on Liz. Our first speaker is Jake Burnyeat.
Yes, Jake's going to speak first. You know Jake, so you might like to give him a little introduction.
Yeah, so everybody, it's my pleasure to introduce Jake Burnyeat from Communities for Renewables. He was, a few years ago, the Community Energy Practitioner of the Year. He's a great expert in this field, supporting communities and community energy. And I'm delighted that you've been able to give us your time, Jake. So thank you very much. So are you ready to go?
I think so. Thanks, Ollie.
Thank you.
Has that done something?
Yeah, your presentation's up on the screen.
Cool. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, amazing to see so many councils here. So my name is Jake Burnyeat. I'm a director of a not-for-profit company called Communities for Renewables, or CFR. I set up CFR in 2012. I've been working in renewables for 17 years. And the reason I set up CFR is, at that time, the UK was beginning to make significant inroads into transitioning from large-scale centralised fossil fuel generation to distributed renewable generation. But we weren't going through a similar economic and social transition. The wind farms and then solar farms that were being built were largely being built by big energy companies, infrastructure funds, and I felt that was a real missed opportunity, because there's no reason why communities can't own their own generation. And so what, 10 years on, more than 10 years on, the UK has made really significant inroads into decarbonising its electricity generation, but really what we haven't made massive changes in how that generation is owned. In 2012, it was very early days for community energy. The concept of a local energy enterprise was quite new. Now it isn't new. There's community energy groups all across the country. There's people, pretty much every part of the country that are interested in doing communities, and there's a good support infrastructure now with organisations such as Community Energy South, Regen, CFR, Energy for All, etc. But we're still very much the minority. I think it's still less than 0.5% of the renewable capacity in the UK is community owned. And I hope with the next wave of renewable development, and there's a lot that still has to come, that we can change that, and communities and parish councils and town councils and city councils can take the lead and realise that there is a significant economic benefit in renewable generation, and more of that capacity that's built out can be locally owned by communities and local authorities. And there's a figure of about £2,000 per head of population leaves any economy on energy spend. That's the combination of electricity, heat and transport, and it's per head of population, not per household. And that's money that, if the energy system was locally owned, could be going round and round in the local economy and a positive economic multiplier rather than a drain on the local economy. The CFR, we're a not-for-profit community interest company. We help communities to set up their own local energy enterprises and work with them to develop, finance and manage their own generation. To date, it's been mostly large-scale solar. We've helped to develop and finance community-owned solar projects with a capital value of about 60 million. And we provide ongoing company and asset management services to 50 megawatts of community solar across 7 localities. And 2 of those projects are in the Community Energy South area, Ferry Farm Community Solar in Selsey and Meadow Blue Community Energy between Chichester and Bognor Regis. Those community solar farms are projected to generate something like £20 million of surplus income over their lifetimes to support net zero transition in their communities and to help tackle fuel poverty and support community organisations. The last community solar farms we built were in 2016. And we had a pause of a few years where it didn't work. The economics weren't there, but they very much are now. Costs have come down, and whilst without a subsidy, the revenue you might earn from a solar farm is roughly half what it would have been in 2016. The cost of building a solar farm is roughly half, and that's why developers are beginning to move again. And if you're a parish councillor, you're probably seeing an increase in applications in your area. Beginning to work on a number of subsidy-free projects that have been initiated by local community groups, 45 megawatts of projects in total, ranging from some very small schemes, 1 megawatt schemes, up to some larger schemes, 16 megawatts with Avesco. And we're also talking to a number of commercial developers about acquiring solar farms that are currently in the planning process into community ownership, either post-consent or post-construction. And commercial developers are generally looking at quite large projects. Most developers are going after 50 megawatt schemes, so that's 100 acres plus. Some are looking at smaller schemes, 15 megawatts, but even those 15 megawatt schemes are 3 times the size of the solar farm that we saw in the days of the feed-in tariff. So what does community ownership mean? Community ownership is not about where the money comes from. It's about the legal and governance structure of the solar farm, how it's legally owned, how it's governed, and where the money goes to. So this shows a typical ownership structure for a community solar project. The solar farm itself is typically owned by a special purpose company that should be an asset locked community interest company. Bigger solar farms, you can't raise all the money from the community, so we tend to use bank debt, and bank debt is cheaper than community investment anyway. So we can raise bank debt at 3%, possibly a bit less. And depending on the economics of the solar farm, the bank might provide us with 50 to 70 or 80% of the capital cost of building it. And they're repaid just like a mortgage over 15 years. The surplus income after the operating costs of the solar farm and the cost of servicing the bank loan goes up to a community parent company, and that money is used to fund the community investors in that company that will provide the balance of the capital needed to build the solar farm, and they'll receive a fixed return of perhaps 4% over 20 years and their capital back. And then all surplus income after operating and finance costs goes towards the local community purpose of that enterprise. The enterprise might be set up to serve a very small area, a parish or a couple of parishes, like the case of Ferry Farm, or it might have a broader remit, serving a county. And the community purpose of these enterprises, it varies, but typically it includes tackling fuel poverty in the local community and reinvesting the money into supporting energy efficiency measures and further net zero transition measures, biodiversity, etc. The community energy enterprise is governed by local volunteer directors. The larger scale enterprises, they don't have to be volunteer run. They'd typically be professionally managed, either in-house or by a community energy manager, such as CFR or Energy for All. And it's kind of important to separate community investment and community ownership. The community investment, when you're trying to raise perhaps £4 million, the likelihood is it's not all going to come from the local community. You can provide priority to local investors, but the investment will come from across the country, probably via a crowd raising platform such as FX or Triodos Crowd. But what you can do is offer people in the local community voting shares, perhaps for £1 voting shares, one member, one vote, so people in the local community can take part in the AGM decisions and have a say in the direction of the enterprise. So how does community compare to commercial ownership? It's a kind of simplified view of things, but ownership, clearly if it's community owned, it's owned by the community. If it's commercial owned, it's owned initially by a commercial developer. And typically solar farms are sold 1 or 2 times in their life cycle. Perhaps post-planning, the developer will sell to a solar construction company that will then sell it on to an infrastructure fund. I don't want to say that's a bad thing. That infrastructure fund might be your pension fund. So it's not that there is no communal benefit from commercial ownership, but it is not owned and serving the local community. If it's community owned, it's locally governed. If it's commercially owned, clearly it's governed by the commercial owner. With community ownership, the return on investment, some of that will go to the local community as far as the investment is local, but the key thing is all the surplus income generated by the solar farm goes to the local community. Whereas with a commercial solar farm, in the feed-in tariff days, they tended to pay a kind of community fund contribution. Now the economics are much tighter. Those contributions either tend to be a one-off upfront payment or a much smaller ongoing payment than they were back in 2016. The generation, whether it's community owned or commercially owned, will go into the local electricity network and it'll be sold to a supplier. If it's community owned, there's probably more incentive for the community energy enterprise to try and come up with some kind of local tariff that enables local people to purchase the energy generated or perhaps to sell the power to a local council or public sector body. And the other local economic benefits are the land rent, which obviously goes to the landowner in both cases. A community solar farm will pay a commercial land rent just like a commercial one, and the business rates will go to the local council. To give an example, a 5 megawatt solar farm in Selsey in West Sussex. It was developed in 2016, originally by a commercial developer and the landowner, Langmead, who some of you may know. It was built out in 2016, and when it was built, there was an agreement that the community could buy it back from the commercial funder within 3 years, which happened last year. And the solar farm is now fully in community ownership, and it's funded through a combination of a £5 million loan from Triodos Bank and just over £1 million that was raised from a community share offer back in 2016 and a community bond offer at the end of last year. That solar farm is expected to generate something like £2 million of surplus income over its lifetime, and it's allocated £200,000 already to local projects to date. Sorts of things it's funded. For the first couple of years, the money was split between a fuel poverty advice service that was run by the town council and a small grant fund that was run by Selsey Community Forum. In March 2020, when the corona crisis hit, we immediately set up a COVID crisis fund that was able to mobilise £40,000 in the first week of lockdown, so well ahead of government money. That crisis fund funded the Chichester Food Bank's operations for a year. It funded something like 50 laptops in total for children in the area that didn't have a device at home to do home learning. It funded the local COVID mutual aid network, provided crisis grants for families that run out of money, and funded a kind of Meals on Wheels thing that, you know, I think we paid for 2 months of meals twice a week for isolated households. Other projects it's funded over the time, a whole range of things: sports, community arts, energy efficiency measures. There's a nice one there, which is the Siddlesham Scout Hut. We help fund replacement heating and lighting for the Scout Hut, and the Scout Hut volunteered to pay some of the savings back into the community fund, so the money could be recycled over time and help other community organisations do the same in future. And the COVID crisis fund, it kind of demonstrated the point of one of these things in helping a community be resilient to shocks, and that shock was obviously COVID related. Future shocks could be climate related. So as a parish, as a community group or a parish council, what are your options? You can do it yourself. Developing a solar farm yourself puts you in control if you can find a suitable site and the risk investment required to get a project through the planning process, and ultimately it will generate the best value for the community. But it is very challenging. It can be done, and it has been done, but to develop a significant scale solar farm, you're looking at something over £200,000 of risk investment to get the solar farm through the planning and grid process, and then possibly the same again to reach financial close of the construction finance. There is funding available at the moment from a government fund called the Rural Community Energy Fund that can provide the first 140,000 or so of that capital. It takes a lot of time, probably 2 years from the start of feasibility through to commissioning. So if the site isn't perfect, you know, if some people do feel that they're more impacted than others, it can divide the community. And in some ways, a community solar project can become more divisive than a commercial solar project. And it does need a lot of volunteer input, even if you have funding and the development is being professionally managed. Working with commercial developers, it has some benefits, and in a way, you know, you may have no choice. It is likely there are commercial developers putting forward projects in your area, and as a community, you can choose whether or not to engage proactively in that. And some developers, and you'll hear from one in a minute, may be willing to consider selling the projects to the local community. And actually, the bulk of the projects that CFR has helped to develop started their life as commercial developments. They weren't initiated as community projects. Some kind of tips on engaging with commercial developers: engage very early if they're willing to, well before the statutory consultation when community opinions can become embedded. And if a community purchase agreement can be agreed up front, it can become part of the planning consideration and the community discussion. And it can actually be made a planning condition for the project. And there are examples of that I can talk about in the Q&A later. I feel strongly that if a community is supporting the project through the planning process and perhaps helping get a consent where otherwise it may be difficult, then their support should be reflected in the agreed price. If you don't get in early, it may still be viable to negotiate a purchase post-consent, but you'll be competing against other commercial buyers that the developer will be engaging with. There are funders who can back a community purchase. but the risk investment needed can still be quite significant upfront. You still probably need £100,000 of risk investment to engage in the transaction process. And as James will say in a minute, it is really important that the developer has an organisation that understands the transaction process that they can engage with. It's a well-trodden path, and so it helps to get an organisation such as CFR or Energy for All engaged at early stages. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. I see we've had a few questions come up in the chat box, and I'm going to propose that we hold them all off and ask all the questions at the end of the presentations. As somebody who's been running these things for a year now, I'm actually surprised we've got fewer questions than we normally have piling into the chat box. So I just wonder if that's because we are overwhelming you with numbers about megawatts and kilowatts and things like that. I've got from my screen, I can see some people shaking their head. I mean, I'm just going to. So, are we all, are we overwhelming you with figures, or are you all happy with this? Right. Okay. It looks like people generally happy. Yeah. So do please keep asking questions, and I'm now going to hand over to James Hartley Bond, who works for a developer who have, in my experience, been quite eager to engage with communities. So I'll hand over to you, James. You can talk a bit more about who you are and what Low Carbon do.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, hello to everyone. Yeah, look, that was a thoroughly useful and an interesting proposal. So thank you to Jake for that. It probably leads quite nicely into some of the themes that I'll talk about as well in this presentation. And I'll try not to sort of labour on things you've already heard, but let me just check. So has that displayed? Can you see the front slide there on screen?
Yeah, we can see that, Jim.
Great, wonderful, fantastic. So yeah, so as introduced, I guess my name's James Hartley Bond, or Jim, feel free, Jim's fine. And so I work for Low Carbon Limited, and I'm the head of project development there. And I guess one of the reasons for being asked today to speak is, as we've said, to give a developer perspective. And really because in my role, we have direct experience of working on a community-owned scheme. What I probably should say, there's probably a few caveats I have to give today. So I'll be referencing other organisations in the presentation. I can't speak on their behalf, nor the wider industry as a whole. And I suppose I should also say I can't offer advice, but really what I want to try and convey is what is possible. Having been through a community scheme successfully, much like Jake was referring to, one that started life entirely as a commercial scheme and is now community owned. And I'll share really, hopefully, the experience and learnings with you so that, the hope is that it can benefit local communities such as yours, if you're interested in exploring options, whether that's to take, say, a minority stake in a project or the entire ownership of a project. Just in terms of what we do, I'll just pausing for a second. It's probably pretty clear from the opening slide, or it gives you a flavour as a company of what sort of projects we're involved in. But I will just sort of talk through a bit about us and our background. So, Low Carbon Limited, we've been around for about 10 years. In fact, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. And we were one of the sort of founding members really of the solar industry in the UK in rolling out solar farms. We are British owned, and our background is in investment and asset management, but we also do development. We do own a number of solar farms ourselves, but as one of the things that Jake sort of touched on is the ownership typically is infrastructure funds or pension funds, largely that own commercial operated solar farms. We have developed over 450 megawatts of solar, ground-mounted solar farms in the UK, and we actually manage just over a gigawatt of renewable energy projects, which is sort of split over a range of sizes and locations, and it's over 100 sites. And we actually look after about 20% of the UK's operational solar farms. And just on the right hand side, you can kind of get hopefully a feeling as to what that equates to in terms of sort of broadly numbers of houses equivalent powered, CO2 savings and such. And then really just wanted to touch the sort of final 2 bullet points here really. There are a few, you may notice a few accreditations and certifications, so we're quite proud of those. But there was one I wanted to touch on really, which is we're a certified B Corporation. Some people may or may not have heard of this particular accreditation. We are one of only a few hundred companies in the UK to have this. It really recognises that, and we are a commercial developer, but it recognises that there can be profit with purpose, and I think that goes to the heart of what low carbon's belief is. So our desire, as you can see there, is to see a future powered 100% by renewable energy, but doing that in a way which is complementary to the environment and putting local communities at the heart of that approach. So really just talking about some of these benefits. I won't labour these next couple of slides too hard, because it has been covered, I think, in part by Jake. I think today we're largely reflecting on probably the first one, the financial element. And Jake did mention some of the kind of how this has worked in the past, whether it's direct contributions, which is essentially a kind of an additional cost in a project, or the ownership route that we're talking about today. Also, that it's worth noting that there are business rates payable from solar farm developments to the local authority. But really, it was just to also just not lose sight of the fact there are other benefits as well, such as, of course, we're generating renewable energy, but essentially we're managing large areas of land, and doing that, it gives a massive opportunity to manage them for biodiversity net gain, and that's something we're really passionate about, and we've seen some really exciting figures. The Environment Bill, which is about to be put into legislation, is looking for all development to have a minimum 10% biodiversity net gain, and running some figures around solar farms. The first few we've looked at, we're talking sort of 150, 160% on some of our sites in terms of biodiversity net gain. So really quite exciting. The image on the right, by the way, is we have on a number of our sites, we have beehives, something we're proud to support. And we have, I think, 2 million bees across our sites. We produce low carbon honey, and that's something we like to give out to local schools and local parish councils as well, in the areas around our projects. And I think that sort of touches on my final point, which is this is also about raising awareness, whether we're doing it, or I suspect if the community was owning projects, there's even more opportunity for communities to really feel that sort of sense of ownership. And really sort of hopefully it becomes a driver for people to change their attitudes towards projects. So really developing a sort of significant change for communities here. Something else we've done is to involve schools and parish councils, and invite them in and give them sort of talks and tours of solar farms as well. But of course, these could equally be opportunities that a community-owned scheme could take on as well. Just to add a little bit more detail, again, I think it's probably been covered largely by Jake, but when we talk about direct contributions, it's kind of, as I was saying, really, it's an additional cost to a project. Certainly it's got more challenging in a subsidy-free environment, and ultimately the way that the power is sold is different now. It's, instead of sort of just being subsidized per kilowatt hour, or the amount of electrons that the site generates, it's now a case that just about all routes to market involve an element of bidding in, whether that's through what's known as a corporate power purchase agreement, or through another auction process. There's one due later this year, but essentially projects have to now be competitive amongst other projects. So there's a natural limit to how much direct contribution can be given. And so really that's where we saw, possible community ownership as a step change in really driving up some of the value in financial terms to communities. But again, not losing sight of what I was kind of saying in terms of, just I think that really taking ownership and the feeling for the community to have an ownership in these projects. You know, we don't underestimate the scale of what we have to do. You know, we've got a dual climate and biodiversity crisis, and that will necessitate deploying projects such as the ones we develop at scale, but we don't believe that it's a long-term sustainable strategy to sort of simply force them on communities. So the more the community can feel a sense of ownership, we feel that's in everyone's interest. And then really just to kind of hopefully touch on the example, I have a case study I mentioned we've just developed or in the process, I suppose, of building out or in conjunction with the Low Carbon Hub. So the Low Carbon Hub, no affiliation or association with ourselves. They are a social enterprise based in Oxfordshire. They have a remit and they've sort of historically developed out lots of small scale solar rooftop schemes, for instance, on community-owned buildings, some hydro schemes. And we encountered them originally through some consultation on a separate project in Oxfordshire near to Aynsham, which we began some discussions with the Low Carbon Hub to really explore. They were very keen to kind of make a jump from the small scale projects and try to take on something far larger. And you know, that process took a number of months on both sides to get comfortable, because I think probably on both sides that, you know, that there was an I guess a fear of could the, you know, or worry, could this happen? Is this a lot of effort spent trying to deliver something which could or couldn't happen? I suppose from a developer's perspective, we would say, you know, is there the possibility that there is a transaction at the end of this? And I guess on the other side, it's, you know, is there trust that this will happen? So these discussions were actually taking place outside of the planning process. For a combination of reasons, and that project was consented, but for a combination of reasons, we got quite far with this discussions, but it actually made sense, and Low Carbon Hub chose to take on a different project, slightly smaller project, 19 megawatts, near Bicester, and that's the project you can see on the right-hand side of the shot there, and it's just started construction, so they're super excited with that. But as part of the agreement we worked through, and that was essentially they purchased the project post-planning, and they've also retained Low Carbon Limited's services to help them through procurement, through project management of the construction, operations and maintenance, and the asset management going forward. And they also recognise that is a great opportunity for them to add further strings to their bow, really, and need to understand and then be able to replicate how to do all of those processes. So aside from purely owning and some of the benefits we'll touch on in a minute, there's also that kind of knowledge growth and passing on the knowledge of how to do it. So a bit about the detail, really. The fact file on the left-hand side is on the Low Carbon Hub's website. Do go and have a look. There's a lot more about the project, Ray Valley Solar Farm, as I said. But just in terms of probably some key numbers, this would be the largest community-owned solar farm in the UK, we believe, and they believe. You know, hopefully they'll be larger as well in time. It will generate 18 gigawatts of clean energy a year, which is enough to power 6,000 homes. And then something they're quite keen to point out, and I heard Jake mention the same thing, really, is it's also this opportunity to, and when in this sense, we're not talking about the revenue side, but we're talking about where essentially the cost or where the spend is going. So rather than spending on fossil fuels, which is leaving the country, having that energy locally is keeping that energy spend locally. But I think that the most significant one that probably most people are interested in is the opportunity and how much money essentially can be returned back into the community. And on this project, Low Carbon Hub are looking to and believe they'll be able to distribute 10 million over the 40-year lifetime back into the local community. So it's a real step change, as I was saying, above the kind of traditional direct contribution. And then just really to give you an idea how it's funded, again, something I heard was mentioned. I think, because of the scale of the projects, broadly speaking, you're probably looking at £500,000 per megawatt to construct, give or take. There's a significant raise here, and some of these Jake was talking about, but there is some lending from Triodos Bank, which is an ethical bank. They tend to support various environmental and community-led initiatives with stringent lending requirements. Prior to and then after the project being taken on by a low carbon hub, there were share raises in place. So there were 2 separate share raises totaling 4.3 million, which has gone into the project. There was also some grant funding, interestingly, on this one. So Innovate UK were looking to support initiatives for sort of smart grid trials through something known as Project Leo. And that's really providing some additional services back to the grid, allowing various things in terms of managing power flows, for instance, in the grid network. But it adds a further funding stream to the project. And then sort of finally, there was a short-term construction fund from a bridging fund from Oxford City Council, and there's the possibility of future share raises to cover any shortfalls or pay any other aspects of that. So really, I've listed a few of the probably lessons and key takeaways, and I'm probably thinking about both sides when I say this, but I'm not speaking for low carbon hub. It's kind of an observation, really. I would say that we're really thrilled to have done this. I know the low carbon hub are as well, but it's not an easy process to go through. It was new for both parties to do a transaction of this nature, and really there was I'll call it a healthy skepticism at the start, and it takes time, it takes trust, and sort of building confidence in one another on both sides, that there's ultimately the possibility of kind of working through a process and getting towards a transaction at the end of that. But what was really helpful was that the low carbon hub as a social enterprise were experienced in developing projects, in raising money, and other aspects of that process. So that was massively helpful to the process. And they do have necessary resource, so in terms of employees, expertise, regulatory accreditations to be able to take on that as an undertaking. And what we've sort of yet to try and find, we found it quite difficult outside of Oxfordshire to find a similar counterparty with all of those kind of skill sets and experience and accreditations. So definitely more challenging for us, but hopefully this is something that will start to change. So really just on some final observations, and I was trying to really think, well, what were our takeaways, or what did we learn from it? And I suppose, we'd say if there's a desire for community ownership, probably the biggest thing that would help is ultimately, being ready to sort of engage early on, and that, my belief, and we see this all the time, and some of you will see it yourselves, is there's probably no shortage of projects proposed. Projects will come. So the best thing, I think, if there's a genuine desire to do this, is to try and put yourselves in a position where you're ready, you're ahead of the curve, and then you can engage on the front foot. And ultimately, hopefully, that's what gets you to a transaction. To look at it from the developer perspective, to kind of, so that you can kind of understand where the developer is looking on this, it's probably quite a difficult process for a developer to get comfortable that on a first meeting, when a project is so far in terms of some initial spend, certain timescales, essentially a project is going to be a liability on a balance sheet until something is realized. There's shareholders to satisfy. So the kind of horizon of thinking, starting a process of forming a community group that may take a year or two to get to that point where it could do something, and also have the belief that it can do that at the end of it. Starting early will make a big difference to that process. But it's not just those kind of commercial pressures. There are other pressures on a developer as well, which is that a planning permission has got to be implemented within 3 years of the consent. And then from a grid point of view, from the connections point of view, and we're certainly seeing it, is that the distribution network operators, so the likes of the SSENs and UK Power Networks, are getting more and more insistent on progress around delivery. So it's harder to sort of sit and wait, because there are added pressures of delivering from a grid connection perspective. And then really just you've already heard, so Jake is far better placed and far more versed in the ways of going through it, but there are social enterprises out there and advisors that can help you with this, but that's it really for me for now. So I'll look forward to the Q&A a bit later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Right, I hope you're all still here. We've got quite a lot of questions going on in the chat box, including a bigger debate about global supply chains and the morality and ethics of that, which I suspect people here in the UK feel as powerless to tackle as people in India. But for now, I think we should focus on what our core idea was, which is how to really get some community energy projects going. So I'm going to hand over to Mark Hinnels from Ricardo. Are you here, Mark? I can't see you. Oh, it looks like you're getting ready to share.
Yep, I'm here. Is that shared now?
Can everyone see it?
Mark, I can see it, but can you put it into presentation mode?
Yep, I thought I had. Sorry.
And welcome, Mark. Thank you very much for joining us. And once again, thanks to Jim for your time as well, Jim. It was great.
Oh, you changed to Jim.
Yeah, you're there.
Right, good stuff. Thanks, everybody. Just by way of introduction, this is one of the solar farms that I was involved in. This was before I joined Ricardo. This is one that Jim might recognise, because this was actually developed with low carbon. This is a Burnyeat solar farm, and the plot of land outlined in red to the north of that site will hopefully shortly become Cuckmere Community Solar, and we hope very much that it will be the first solar farm that is directly connected to the traction side of the rail network and supply power straight into the rail network to power trains. So that's a little brief introduction to me and my background, a little bit of an introduction to Ricardo. It's quite a large organization, Ricardo. We've got about 4,000 people, about 600 in energy and environment, and others in other aspects of sustainability. Our headquarters are down in Shoreham in East Sussex, so we're a local company to Community Energy South and do quite a lot of work with Community Energy South. We work with not only renewable energy development, but with large organisations that have a large impact, from local authorities to the water sector to a Ministry of Justice. We've done plans for a portfolio of 18 odd prisons recently. That kind of organisation. So we're looking to drive sustainability in the public and private sectors. And part of that is through renewables. The work that we did on the right for Water UK for the entire water sector, for the water sector to transition to net zero, included the opportunity for quite a lot of renewables on water sites, because they have big land holdings and water holdings, and supplying water loads either on those sites or on other sites within the water company portfolio. But renewables can play a really important role in that transition to net zero, and in the water sector, particularly solar and wind, with some opportunity for hydro in certain key areas as well. Moving on, I just wanted to put the work that we're looking at now, the opportunity that we're looking at now, against the background of the market as a whole. So over the last 10 years, as we've been developing solar, it started really with a heavily financially supported market with the feed-in tariffs and the renewable obligation certificates. Those have both effectively gone. There is another support program that Jim mentioned, which is the feed-in tariff what's called a contract for difference now, but that's quite a difficult market for communities to get into. And so a lot of schemes are operating outside a support mechanism, basically on their own 2 feet. One of the other challenges is that the grid, as presently configured, and this is changing because of the investment that's going into the grid as presently configured is largely, not completely, but largely full to new generation. That's changing all the time, and that's a really challenging issue for communities to keep on top of. And as mentioned previously, cost of kits come down very significantly. So as cost of as support has been withdrawn, probably slightly faster than costs have fallen, but we are now in a state where schemes can be competitive, and they are competitive in 2 very particular ways. We've talked already about sizes going up, and economies of scale really do matter to making schemes commercially viable in current circumstances. But one of the other ways of making a scheme attractive is to increase the value of the power. There's 2 particular ways to do that. One is to supply the power direct to a site, and I've already hinted at that with the work that we've been doing with the water sector, where there's a scheme on water company owned land supplying water company owned assets with power. So that private wire approach is very valuable. When power supplied directly on site, it displaces imported power, and there are so many more costs to the power than just the generation. You've got to move it there, you've got to balance it with all of the different demands and supply going on the network, and in moving to that site, there are policy costs that go on to pay for the feed-in tariffs and ROCs that we've currently got. So displacing power on site, if you like, at retail levels, is much more valuable than exporting power at wholesale market levels. And that's one of the real opportunities, I think, at the present time for communities, is to get into that private wire market. What loads have you got in your area to supply sites? And that could enable a scheme to be smaller, requiring a lower level of capital investment, but still very profitable because it's more valuable power. So I mentioned before, work with Network Rail to supply power direct to the rail line. That's more valuable. Work to supply water companies. We've been looking at work to supply prisons, airports, all sorts of high energy consuming sites where the power that you produce is more valuable. Another way to make a scheme more cost effective is to find low value land. Some councils have land that they own for historical reasons. Some of it is next to an industrial site or part of an industrial site, and they see an opportunity for expansion there. Some of it they've had in their ownership for historical reasons, and it's currently farmed out by a tenant farmer. And that's another way to make a scheme viable. And the final way to make a scheme attractive is to reduce the development costs. So rather than going through an expensive and upfront risk of a planning application, can you find a site that actually doesn't need planning? And defined in planning legislation, there are a number of types of organisations that are described in legislation as statutory undertakers, who can develop particularly solar installations on their sites without getting full planning, and that reduces the upfront costs hugely. Statutory undertakers include the water companies and the airports. They, to an extent, include the rail network, but they end up with a very long, thin ribbon kind of right to develop sites, and that doesn't necessarily suit large-scale solar. But there is potentially an opportunity there. So those are the niches, the different niches where it's more cost-effective to develop renewables now compared to in the past, where everything got subsidy support. And obviously, if you can combine those options, that's ideal. So we've recently done work to explore supplying power to a rail network using land that was owned by council. And in those contexts, the beneficiaries are multiple, and there's that again could be a community-owned scheme. So, in a sense, that's almost, isn't it? That's almost the definition of sustainable development, where you've got an economic benefit to the rail provider, which reduces their cost of power and decarbonises public transport. You've got an economic benefit to the council. You've got an environmental benefit because you're using renewable energy, and you've got a social benefit because it's community owned, and there's very good reasons to combine those benefits, because that just makes it easier at planning. So moving on, I've got some examples in here, but we've been through some examples, so I will skip these. But what I wanted to draw your attention to was the operational sites were developed some years ago. Westmill Solar is a scheme that I'm a shareholder in, and a couple of us in Ricardo are active as directors within Westmill. There's Meadow Blue. Those were developed under the feed-in tariff framework, which incentivized schemes up to about 5 megawatts. But as we go forward in time, we've got Low Carbon Hub, which the scheme, the Ray Valley scheme, which we heard about just now, at 19 megawatts. The biggest project that I know is a project under development that straddles the England-Wales border in Inuit, at Bretton Hall, which is planned to be around 40 megawatts. The size might change a little bit, and I've put on one side that's out to consultation at the moment. And because in Wales they've got a slightly different planning framework, because it straddles the Welsh-English border, it needs consent from both sides. That's a planning inspector at Wales project. I've put the web reference in there so that you can go and have a look at the kind of consultation process that the projects have to go through, and there's an extract from the consultation boards there. But what you can see is happening there is that community projects are getting bigger. So that fits with the market trend, that projects need to be bigger to survive. And Bretton Hall at the moment, the project is exploring private wire to 2 possible customers, one that would take some of the power and one that would take all of the power, pretty much, from that site. So again, you can see a trend to the kind of the themes that are happening at national level to make projects work. But that 40 megawatt project is 20 to 25 million, depending exactly on costs. The grid connection there is going to be quite expensive, but it does depend on whether it finally in the end goes into the DNO, the distribution network operator grid connection, or whether it goes into a private wire customer. The grid connection, there's a little bit of uncertainty about those costs, but that's a huge amount of money for a community to raise. It won't all be obviously community funded. There will be co-funding in that of a number of different types, but really exciting sets of developments in the community space. Some other examples of the kinds of projects that I'm talking about as being exciting and cost effective in this new world. The project at the top right hand corner is Cornwall Airport, and just to the south of the runway there's a long thin blue strip just to the south of the main airport development, which is I don't know whether you can see my mouse won't show up. Sorry, I would like to be able to point it out. Perhaps I should have outlined it in red. But there's a 5 megawatt solar farm there, owned by Cornwall Council, I believe, and supplying the airport. So again, hitting some of the kinds of mix of benefits that I've been talking about. And then the bottom picture is a solar farm that's built on a former landfill site, and it's got, because of that, it's got a different mounting system for the frames that doesn't penetrate the landfill cap. And I raised this because that was quite an interesting site. The community there, Bairnsfield, developed a neighbourhood plan, and they were very keen on renewables as part of a neighbourhood plan. And so even though that solar farm was in Green Belt, it was so uncontroversial, it didn't even need to go to planning committee because it had community support and it was on brownfield land. So that just sailed through planning. And so where you've got the right circumstance, that kind of project, community involvement really helps. I saw in the questions, why can't we do this on car parks? There's a small car park scheme. It's a leisure centre in Oxford. It's about 80 kilowatts on the car park area and about 120 on the roof of the leisure centre next door. And that actually was financed by the City Council on using a Salix loan fund for their assets. But it's obviously it's as councillors, that's the sort of project that now should be almost bread and butter for a council to be working on. It's not so much a community scheme. There's no reason why it couldn't be a community scheme going forward or somewhere else. But there is also the possibility for loan for the council as well as another way of delivering it. And then the final example is that floating solar scheme is on QE2 Reservoir, just west and south of Heathrow Airport. It's a 6.2 megawatt scheme, and so that's probably around 24,000 solar panels in that array, something like that. And one of the advantages on that site, again, combining some of the opportunities that I've talked about earlier, this is very cheap land. There's no rent because it's floating on the reservoir, and it supplies power into Thames Water, who need that power for their pumping operations in that area. So it hits two of the themes that make renewables nowadays cost effective. Again, because Thames Water were a statutory undertaker, it had a relatively easy passage through the planning system. It ended up as permitted development, and again, because this is a big concrete basin, the impacts on habitats and so on is very limited in this area. So, and in fact, there are benefits for reservoir operators because it reduces evaporation, it reduces the solar gain in the reservoir, so it reduces temperature a little bit, it reduces algae, and then it reduces chemical use to purify the water in there. So there are actually benefits apart from the solar benefits. There are co-benefits, if you like, for the reservoir operator. So those are some examples. Where does that leave us in terms of what councils and councillors can do? I've gone through a number of models in the next few slides, and I'm aware that we're a little bit short of time, so I'll press through them, but you'll have the slides for afterwards. The Localism Act in 2011 was quite helpful because it set the opportunity for neighbourhood plans. Neighbourhood plans, as in the Baronsfield example I talked about earlier, can be important in supporting renewable energy schemes. If communities can show that because of climate emergency, this is what we need in terms of renewables. Climate emergency is now declared by 3/4 of councils. On the other hand, the plan making process to deliver benefits to deliver low carbon communities following that is at a much is significantly behind that. There are probably only 100 or so local authorities with a plan, and there are probably only 20 or so local authorities with a good plan. And by that I mean plans that go beyond just buying renewable electricity from the grid and buying some kind of green gas for their own assets. A good plan would go beyond the local authority's own assets. It would go beyond just buying power and gas. It would talk about capital investment, and it would talk about behaviour change, and it would form partnerships with major organisations locally, the hospitals, the universities, the major employers. A good example of that, I have to say, I'm based in Oxford. I'm probably biased, but Oxford have done a very good job at local planning level of developing responses for the climate emergency. But what's in it for local communities there? For me, what's in it is the really exciting possibility of binding not only renewable energy, but community-owned renewable energy into a local plan, because it's sustainable development. It's combining economic, social, and environmental benefits together. The other opportunity from that is at the wider planning level to develop supplementary planning guidance. And Luton Borough Council, who have a net zero target by 2040, which rather more difficult than most authorities, has to include an airport. It's their own airport, but they're including the emissions from ground-based activities in that net zero target. And so they are developing supplementary planning guidance to guide the very significant local development that's going on, not only on the airport, but around the airport and into the town centre regeneration. So supplementary planning guidance for delivering climate and renewable energy would be really helpful. The other thing that a local authority can do is lead investment, and Cornwall Council, Swindon through Public Power Solutions, and Luton are all leading examples of that. In the interest of time, I'll skip this, but just in headline terms, these are the major issues that, when it comes to assessing a planning application, a local authority would be looking at. And if the community feels that some of these issues are more sensitive than others, then these are the areas to negotiate as a community on with the planning officers, with the developer, and potentially with the landlord as well. The landlord is actually a really important player in all of this, but I would, on behalf of landlords, put out a plea in that there are landlords that have felt really pressured, and they are the focus of this pro and anti lobby that can develop locally, and some landlords have found it such a pressure that they've taken their own life, and that's not a situation that I think any local community should have on its conscience, quite frankly. Yes, some of the developments can be controversial, but we need to deal with climate change. That's the bottom line. There might be local impacts, but climate change is a global issue, and I would encourage you to go look at the Committee on Climate Change work on the 6th Carbon Budget and yesterday's launch of the Climate Impacts Programme. Climate change is a really, really serious issue, and balancing global issues with local impacts is difficult, but it can be negotiated. So rather than seeing it as a confrontation issue, I'd encourage people to see it as a negotiation. To sum all of this up, there might be a number of different models that you want to think about, how you lead as a councillor in a local community going forward. Do you want to be a plan setter? Do you want to influence the shape of the plan through a neighbourhood plan or supplementary planning guidance? Do you want to be a partner in a particular scheme and invest or bring forward, as we've seen in Oxfordshire at Ray Valley? Do you want to be a developer, as we've seen perhaps at Cuckmere with Cuckmere Community Solar and the partnership with Riding Sunbeams, and the support that could be gained from that from the Royal Community Energy Fund? Do you want to be the negotiator that accepts that we need to do renewables, but looks to minimise the pressure points that there might be to minimise the particular impacts, and perhaps is there an opportunity for you to be a beneficiary to secure a community benefit fund? And we've seen payments for solar farms in the past that might pay for additional renewable energy installations on community buildings, for example. So there can be a one-off cash benefit to the community, which then delivers a lifetime of benefit in terms of energy savings and income stream that can be used for other things. So those are the possible models that I think the community might have in this very rapidly changing environment of developing projects and the possible roles that communities might play. Liz, I think it's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, I think Ollie wants to start off with the questions, and then my colleagues Jessie, Michael and Nicola have been keeping an eye on the chat box, I think. So I'll invite you three to unmute yourselves, and then you can invite people to unmute themselves or ask questions, if that's okay. Because I think you know who's got the good questions. But yeah. Ollie, let me hand over to you first. We have 20 minutes.
So we've got about 23 minutes, so that's brilliant. I just wanted to say, Mark, he sold himself short a little bit. Dr. Mark Hinnels is also a lecturer at the Centre for Sustainable Energy. So I'm really grateful for your time, Mark, and coming in and just summarising those last few slides about, you know, where local authorities or parish councils and communities, where they sit and stand, and how you can get involved in your positioning, because what we're seeing is a lot of parish councils coming to us, community and chat, and saying, you know, what do we do, where do we stand, and what have you, and think about that. I think it's a case of be prepared as a community, understand your energy usage as a community, but also what you would want out of a solar farm, and what the benefits are, and how you approach a planning application like that. So I suppose my question back to the panelists is, what's your advice for parish councils if they have a solar farm come up for planning in their area? You know, I guess Jim would be a good person to ask first. You know, how would you, what would be your advice to them for finding out about the scheme and how to engage with the scheme?
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, so I suppose we have first-hand experience of it. Again, I suppose going back to my point, I'll probably have to refrain from giving advice, and I can't speak for the entire industry, but perhaps if I say sort of how we approach it, we're generally pretty on the front foot with, as soon as we're ready to kind of go public with a proposal, and that's generally in fairly early stages, is to engage the parish councils around the site. You know, it may be that the project sits within one particular area, or it could sit across boundaries, and there may be other neighbouring parish councils very close to that boundary. But we take a fairly proactive view of engagement. Look, I guess we're always open to discussions on community benefit, community ownership. It's a really difficult one to know how and when to bring it up, because if we kind of bring it up initially, then sometimes that could be seen in a negative light, that it might be offensive to some, in that feels like we're trying to sort of buy their support. If we say nothing at all, then there's the potential for that to be seen as, well, we're trying to hide it. So there's a really difficult, you know, I'd be really interested if there's a view, a kind of consensus on perhaps the best way of going about that. But I guess, look, I suppose it comes back to the points I was making, I guess, from my point of view, is that I guess my desire from this is, and this may ultimately not benefit us, that, you know, we will, other developers will come along, of course, but and it may benefit them from discussions that you have with them in future, but ultimately the goal here is to try and benefit you, your communities. So because that difficult point is, once a proposal is there, there's a kind of a lot of background work has been done for you to kind of start and organize a community group at that point and get ready for the transaction to be able to purchase it. You're kind of starting from a running start. So if you have those structures in place before, then at the time when those projects come along, you're just probably in a far better position to be able to then say, great, you know, we have this structure, we have this desire, and that there can also be a bit of belief from the developer that actually this is a perfectly legitimate way and likely way of ultimately developing and selling a project.
We've got a question here from Keith Oborn. Keith, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi there. Yeah, Bramley, North Basingstoke. We some months ago had an ad from Enso Energy, probably 40 odd megawatt farm. The reason it's an attractive point for them is that just north of our village we have a major national grid station which happens to have spare transformer taps. The problem is that the size and location of this installation is very close to existing residential areas and indeed to areas of historic interest. The developer seems to be very, very uninterested in engaging with us and banging on the climate emergency from Basingstoke. Many other councils have ticked that particular publicity box. We can't seem to get any sensible engagement with these people at all. They just don't seem to think it's worth even talking to us. Any idea?
Mark, can you might have some observations about that?
Yeah, this is some of this is related to the previous question as well. For renewable energy projects, for a parish council to object to a development, particularly if it phrases its objections in very meaningful planning terms, it's quite hard for a planning committee to ignore that.
Yeah, so to interrupt, yes, we have objected in those terms. We understand how to drive the planning system. It doesn't really make a lot of difference.
Yeah. The issue, what sounds like in your case that the sensitive issue is the proximity to dwellings. We also have this. We've had this issue at a number of sites. The most, in planning terms, the most sensitive receptors, if you like, put it in planning language, to a development are if there's any listed buildings nearby, because there's very good case law that renewables cannot damage the setting of heritage assets.
Understood. I live in a listed building.
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. What the problem is, we want to support this project.
Yeah.
Okay. The application went in a long time ago and is rumbling through our local planning. My neighbour is vice chairman of the development committee. We want to support this project, but we want to engage with these people and say, we will support you if you will make the following changes.
Yes.
Right? And there is no response.
Well, that's something that, ultimately this may end up at appeal by the sounds of it. And you have to have half a mind to how it might end up at appeal. And so having a reasonableness that puts your objections in very strong planning terms, and not having them dealt with, if it does go to appeal, puts you in a strong position, particularly to get the support, but with the following conditions. If those conditions don't appear in some form of decision, it's very disappointing, I have to say, to hear a developer behaving like that. I thought we'd all grown up a bit, to be honest, but there we are. The impact. So I've talked about the impact on heritage assets, the impact on residential assets, in policy terms, is unfortunately not so well protected. The impact on residential dwellings is not seen in by planning as a major issue. There's no right to a view, for example, and solar farms can get relatively close to buildings and dwellings without it being a planning objection. There could be a negotiation with the company, but only if the company is willing to negotiate. You can't negotiate on your own, and it's quite difficult to force that on them through the planning system. The other issue that I would flag as a potential issue is some inverters are noisier than others. If they've got central inverters rather than string inverters, and if those inverters are close to dwellings, then if they've not done a noise study on those, that could be a material failing if you ever got to appeal.
Yeah, we haven't studied. It doesn't look like a problem.
Sorry, I'm not sure whether you. Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, there's a noise study. It doesn't look like that's a problem.
It doesn't look like there's a problem. Okay.
No, not least because the next to the national grid substation, which by definition is not quiet.
Yeah. Okay. The final fallback is there a planting regime that could screen it either in noise terms or in visual terms, or at least provide some separation with dwellings. Those are the issues that I would want to be seeking to negotiate on. But ultimately, if they've not dealt with legitimate objections, then what the planning committee can do is neither consent nor refuse, but say but direct the applicant to go back and deal with the legitimate concerns that have been raised, and if they don't deal with those concerns, then there are grounds for refusal. If they do deal with those concerns, then it could be something that could then be supported. But it's really unfortunate. It's really disappointing to hear of a developer that's not addressing those issues, because, as I say, in principle, we need the developments, but the pinch points, the pressure points, the negotiation points need dealing with.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, we've got about 3 people ask questions about private wires and the length of private wires. I don't know if anybody can answer that.
Yeah, I can probably pick that up if that's all right. Putting a private, I mean, if you put a private wire in, you don't need an ordinary grid connection. So there are swings and roundabouts, and comparing the costs and benefits of private wire is an important task. It's not something that very many developers have dealt with. There are probably something like 100 or so wind schemes in the UK, and probably 20, 30 or so large-scale solar farm assets, either on roofs or adjacent to developments. They're very common in the car industry. There are lots of those in the water industry, and they're becoming more common. So there is a prior art, if you like, but you need to look at the benefits, which could be a saving of 3p a kilowatt hour for the generator, and 3p a kilowatt hour saving for the customer. Maybe not quite as much as that nowadays. Maybe 2 and 2, something like that. And within that saving, there should be a budget to spend more on grid than you would normally do, but you're avoiding the main grid connection. So it's quite a complicated assessment, but all of the private wire schemes we've looked at are very cost effective, with good payback periods. And if the solar farm exists already, we looked at one site, the prison, where the payback period to connect into the prison was less than a year, and it's still not happened. But we're working on that with Ministry of Justice.
Okay, we know Sagar has a lot to say and has raised important issues about the global supply chain issue, which, yeah, and we're really open to hearing what you think we can do as, we're not manufacturers, we're not that end of the supply chain, but yes, do please say what you think might be helpful.
Hi, thank you. My interest is supply chains. And if someone's going to tell me something's green, then they'd better sure pray to God that they've gone straight to the beginning of the supply chain and shown me every single thing. And at the moment, there is this delusion amongst people in the climate change movement, and I'm going to be cold honest here, that renewables are fossil fuel free. That's just like, I don't know whether to laugh or cry at that. I've spoken to so many people in the industry, in building industry, and they says fossil fuel free. How are you going to make your cement or your plastic or your other materials that you require for your wind turbines? So here's the thing. When I look at the fact that lithium is a major component of solar panels, and to get that lithium, my communities in India, because we are here to talk about communities, are completely displaced and disheveled of our indigenous forests, of our heritage forests, as someone mentioned here, heritage assets. I'd like to ask the question to anyone in the panel, the companies, the councils, everyone, that when brown lives do not matter, or black lives do not matter when it comes to profits and sustainability, then what's going to give? Is it going to be that when the resources have been completely extracted out of India, the 50 billion pounds worth of lithium that is lying under Cornwall, I don't mean Cornwall in India because there isn't one in India, I mean Cornwall in England, is going to be the crux of where people wake up. We can't grow food and we can't access water. And this notion that renewables are net zero, please, come on, whole forests are removed. Like, you know, this isn't stand-up comedy here. I'm serious here. And it's laudable that people think renewables are fossil fuel free. Women and girls are raped. Hello, what part of this do you not understand? Women's rights not exist. So someone please justify to me as to how this is not only not net zero, but how this is net zero, but how is this sustainable?
So can I try and answer your question?
But this is not sustainable at all. Let's talk about Cornwall and Cumbria. Why is it okay to mine lithium in Cornwall, but not okay to mine the coal from Cumbria required to make the lithium?
So Sagar, can I answer your question?
Thank you.
So Ollie said before the Centre for Sustainable Energy. It's not quite. I'm at CAT, Centre for Alternative Technology, and I teach on the MSc program there. Have done for a number of years. The whole life aspect of renewables is something that we do on the program, and if you're that passionate about it, I'd encourage you to look at the MSc program there. What I would say is that the energy payback of renewable energy is of the order of months. And it's different for wind and solar. For solar, it's declining rapidly because of the improvement in efficiency of the panels and the improvements in the manufacturing techniques in the panels. But what I would encourage you to do is to compare them with other forms of generation. Nuclear is or coal or gas, and look at all of them on a life cycle basis. If you want no development, then turn off your internet.
No, that's not acceptable.
Because
that's not acceptable.
No,
come to my forests in India. That's not acceptable. That is privileged, and that's colonial privilege.
No,
that's not acceptable.
No,
that is not acceptable answer at all.
You can make the choice. If you don't want to use those assets, then make your choice. But
I'm going to interrupt here because this session, Sagar, I did suggest to you that we get together and perhaps put together a session about supply chain issues. But for now, we have got limited time, and there are a lot of parish councillors here who want to know how they can make community energy happen in their community. So for now, I'm going to hand over to Janice. And Sagar, I'm really happy to talk to you after this because I don't want to exclude you, but I do want to focus on what we came here to talk about, which doesn't mean we don't want to look at supply chain issues and what's going on in India.
Thank you very much. I just want some advice. Mid Sussex District Council, who do not have any association, as far as I can see, with any partnership groups to do with climate change or emergency or energy or anything, have set up a sustainable economic strategy working party. We're going to meet about 5 times. Now, the emphasis seems to be on economy. So I really need some advice. We've declared a climate change, climate emergency at Mid-Sussex. I need some advice as how I can make sure that in this strategy, we actually address the interest of climate emergency, because this particular council, they have a lot of policies. They don't really comply with their policies. Sorry, I am a district councillor, one of a minority. I'd appreciate some advice. Thank you.
Can anyone answer Janice? I know Sophie Fernley-Whittingstall, are you able to help if you're here?
Well, while Sophie thinks about it, I'll just chip in a little bit, Janice, and thank you very much. What is happening at the moment in the UK is we have something called local area energy planning, and that gives you a lot of background. So in mid-Sussex, the Greater Brighton region has undertaken a regional energy strategy and approach, which covers mid-Sussex and should inform the mid-Sussex Council about their approach to climate change and renewables and energy. But these local area energy plans can be very sort of district focused and give you the policy requirements for your cabinet to take on climate change as far as energy is concerned. So definitely look at local area energy planning. The Energy Systems Catchbolt is leading on it in the region, and it's really useful to look at. I'm happy to pick that up with you separately. And I think that is a really helpful approach at local authority level to embed it in strategy.
So, sorry, Ollie, you said it was part of the Greater Brighton.
Yeah, so in mid-Sussex, you're part of the Greater Brighton Infrastructure Panel Committee, and mid-Sussex is part of that, and they have a climate change strategy that your council signed up to. So
can you send me a link or something to this so I can follow this up?
I think I've got your email. Let me just say, and I'll email you.
Thank you.
I think if I can chip in, I know that we're short of time, but I think it's such a really important issue that it might actually be worth a whole follow-on session about what local authorities can do in planning terms. I don't mean just the planning system. I mean in terms of laying out a strategy as to how to get to net zero. The core is for their own assets, but that's such a limited set of impacts that it needs to go beyond that. It needs to go to partnership building with the major employers and organisations in their area. And as I say, the opportunity to develop renewables that are community owned ideally, but right across the authority, and also make lay plans for the whole portfolio of of sustainable infrastructure that we need. I think is an issue all of its own, but I think in headline there's a couple of good plans. I would encourage you to look at the Oxford response to climate, and probably Bristol as well. And North Somerset's actually quite good too. Somerset as a whole has done quite a good job as a group of authorities in terms of local emergency, climate emergency. The other issue I would put in, again, having watched the CCC response yesterday, the CCC launch yesterday of its adaptation plan, is that a lot of the climate emergency response at the moment is about mitigation. We really shouldn't forget adaptation, because we are committed to an element of climate change already. And so I would go to the CCC work launched yesterday to look at that adaptation planning and make sure that that's included in climate emergency responses.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and I was just going to add, on this whole topic is that, our observation at Community Energy South is we're working with local authorities, Essex County Council, Hampshire, Lewis District Council, to name but a few, who are really, and Uttlesford in Essex, who are really starting to embed net zero strategies into their council policies, and that's helpful. And having those local area energy plans in the background is really useful. So, Janice, I'd message you in this chat. Can you just message me back with your email address, please?
It's coming to a close, and I realise I forgot to share the results of the poll. So I've just shared them in case they're of interest to anybody. And I should have shared that much earlier on. I just want to say I'm really sorry to all the people that we didn't get a chance to answer your questions. You can download the chat box, and you might find answers and links in the chat box. To download the chat box, you go to the little 3 dots where on the right-hand corner where it says type message here, and you can download what's in the chat box from there. We'll go through, and I'm going to send the questions to our speakers, and if there are any other responses they want to give, we'll send them out. We'll put the presentations and the recording on our website and send that out. And I don't know what else to say. Personally, I'm feeling a bit upset about SAGAR, because I just found that upsetting, and I don't want to do anything. I don't know what else to say.
I'll tell you what, Liz, I'll summarize that. I think, we're all wanting the best outcome and to get to net zero. And I'm very happy to pick up with SAGAR and link him up with Solar UK and look at those supply chain issues and see if we can help. So SAGAR, do email me back. I've given you my email address. And everyone else, thank you very much. The chat and the presentations will be available on our website, and we've recorded it as well. So do share it and keep in touch.
Can I just add one thing, Ollie? We are all learning, and we will never stop learning. If somebody wants to do some more learning, SAGAR or anybody else, the Centre for Alternative Technology, as I say, has a master's degree program, and SAGAR, I have to say, that would make a very good master's dissertation. If there are lessons to learn, let's learn them.
Yeah, and likewise, if we want to do a webinar about it, which is what I suggested to you, if we want to create a webinar about supply chain issues, I'm really happy to work with you to do that. I can't see you now. Are you still here? Unmute yourself and say.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Very much, everybody. And speakers, thank you to Jake, Jim, and Mark. That was a really good session, and for everybody for joining. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.